Thursday presenter is John Simpson. And many of you know who John is. He's not a stranger to the museum. He's not a stranger to our programs. He has presented on his Civil War Letters series. And now those have become a book, which is All for the Union, Civil War Letters. And tonight he's going to talk about some of the things that might not have made it into the book that you will get to experience this evening. And I do want to give a little credit here also to our past director, David Fries, who's here in our live audience, because he connected with John back in 2013 when those letters first arrived at the museum. And there was about 180 original Civil War letters that were written by two brothers and two brothers-in-laws to their three sisters and wives. And John cataloged and organized them and then created this book ultimately as the final project. So please come by at the front of the museum after the program if you haven't had a chance to purchase one of John's books. If you are in our live or our online audience, come to the museum. We will have the books at our gift shop as well. So without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over here to Dr. John Simpson, who will share us a little bit about his book and what others might not see and what we get to see tonight. One moment here to here's a laser, by the way. Okay. Just one moment so we can transition here to we're going to do screen share now. And actually, John, I'll let you pop into here so you can just say quick hello to our online people. There you are.
Hello, everybody.
We're going to do share screen here. Okay.
Oh, there's Jim.
If you're in slideshow, you should be good to go. And then your laser's there if you want.
Okay, and I don't need a mic or anything.
You don't need a mic. You can just talk and you'll see how they see you right here.
Oh, okay. Very good. Well, I would like to open up with greetings to all of you who have come in person. Almost all of you are familiar faces to me. I'd also like to invite and greet those of you who are watching online, and some of your faces look familiar as well. In terms of the Zoom, I know that we have folks as close as my next door neighbors up on the old Kelso Hill, to my brother up in Ferndale, and my cousin in Vancouver, British Columbia, and my daughter in Wyoming. So this talk is reaching a wide geographic area. We're going international. Well, and also this is Cinco de Mayo. I wanted to point that out. That's a great occasion for all of us. But I do have one piece of bad news, and that is there seems to be a rumor going around that there will be free margaritas after the talk. And I want to dispel that right now as fake news. And I'd like to thank Joseph and the staff here at the museum. Bill Watson has done awfully fine work, and I've borrowed from him, and the handout that you have that we'll look at the end of the talk is directly a product of his research. And Jim Elliott, who I wish to point out online that Jim, I do now have a brand new laptop computer, and I was wanting to share it with you this evening, but that won't happen. I'd like to give a special shout out to Rose Janke, a charter member of the Lower Columbia Genealogical Society. She helped me a great deal with insider tips on how genealogists work. And you'll find when you look in the dedication page, I've dedicated the book in part to her. This book is, after all, a Civil War topic, but it is deeply steeped in our local history, as I know all of you folks who have been here before realize. In fact, All for the Union was born on January 6, 2014, in the office just around the corner in David's office. And Joseph did a very nice job in explaining how David brought the letters to my attention in the first place. Just a brief recap. Most of you know that the letters were turned in here to the Historical Society, 180 letters in all, which is a very sizable collection from the four boys, two brothers-in-law. And I did take the first 6 months, as some of you might remember, just reading the letters, taking notes on them, cataloging them like a librarian would, really, or an archivist, before I even proceeded beyond that. Then I took an entire year to read up on the Union Army during the Civil War, because although I am trained as a Civil War historian, my specialty had been in Confederate history, and Confederate history in the Western Theater, which means basically Tennessee. But to get ready for this book, all that knowledge was not of great help. So I took a year to read a great deal about Civil War generals, Civil War battles in the Eastern Theater, because that's where these boys were fighting. They were fighting with the Army of the Potomac, primarily in Virginia. So that kind of gives you an idea of a little bit of the background in terms of how we eventually pieced this whole book together. But it's interesting, I think, for all of you to know that the book you see in front of you is the 6th draft of the topic. You don't just sit down and write a book and have it accepted in the first or the second go around, unless you're somebody very famous. But anyhow, I want to begin the talk tonight by let me see if I can get my slides here going correctly. Do I point it at the screen, Joseph, or did it?
Probably just hit the space bar.
Okay, to refresh the screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then that'll advance the slides every time.
Okay.
There might be a way
I
to
see.
plug that in to do it too.
I
but
see that.
forgot.
Let's not worry about it. Those of you who have been with us in the previous programs know that All for the Union was not the original title. As you can see here, the original title was the Ellithorpe Boys of Western New York and their Civil War. Well, that wasn't a totally accurate title, because yes, there were two brothers, but there were also two brothers-in-law. And so along with my publisher, we decided, okay, we're going to change the word boys to brothers, the Ellithorpe brothers of Western New York and their Civil War. Well, my publisher said, you know, the ladies in this book, primarily the two sisters, play a major part in the story. So we took brothers out and put family in, the Ellithorpe family. And I thought that's where we were going to land. But alas, we weren't, because the editors, and you know, they know their market. They said, we need to take the family name out. We want to broaden the interest by just saying that this is a story of a Northern family fighting the Civil War. and leaving New York out of it, because if somebody in South Carolina were to see this topic, they might not be interested if it's got New York in it. But one family fighting the Civil War is a little different story. So that's I just wanted to kind of clarify that over time, this happens in the publishing realm, and it's perfectly okay. And I'll tell you, who tipped the scale was my wife, because I was sitting at the table one night saying, gee, they want to change it. Here we go, all for the union. I'm not sure I like that. And she said, you know, I like it plenty. So that was that. So, okay, all for the union. Now, those of you who have been here before know the family lineage here. And this is to just kind of give a little bit of a review for you folks who have been here before, and it's also new information. This lineup of names is, these are the main characters in the book. The top two are the parents, Lyman and Fanny Ellithorpe. Then you have brother Danforth Sanford Ellithorpe, but notice at the end of his name, the E is in parentheses, and I'm going to talk about that as the first mystery and how I solved it. Then you have the oldest sister, Anne Ellithorpe, and she married a man by the name of Burleson. Mary Ellithorpe married a man named Moore, whose grandchildren eventually came to a small town on the Cowlitz River in the 1920s and 40s, the Moores, and they brought the Civil War letters with them. Philander Ellithorpe is the one of the brothers who writes about 40 of the letters. Philip Ellithorpe, he's the star, I guess. He writes 100 of the letters. And if this was a biography, this would be a biography of Philip Griggs Ellithorpe. So you'll notice the three primary characters have red stars beside them, and that's to signify to you that these are key players in the story. And then the youngster in the family, Permilia Ellithorpe. So into the mysteries, this is the fun part. Joseph, am I able to back up a screen at any time? No, okay, doesn't matter. We won't worry about that. Remember when I showed you Danforth, the oldest sibling? Well, Danforth presents a real interesting situation because for all of his life, he spelled his name without the E on the end. And you might remember in one of my talks, I mentioned the different ways I came across the spelling of Ellithorpe. Sometimes it was with one L, sometimes it was with an E on the end, sometimes no E on the end. I've seen the L's turned into T's for Edithorpe. I've seen the Thorpe changed into Trope, Ellitrope. And these would be examples of census recordings, which was oftentimes orally done. It was in city directories, which again was more than likely orally transmitted. And so the person taking down the name was sometimes not getting it exactly right. And in fact, in one case, if you think of the name Lathrop and make the first letter a syllable all by itself, you don't have Lathrop or Lathrop, you have L, a Thorpe. So all of these kind of subtle name spelling changes could cause a person headaches. My big problem with Danforth is I'm not quite sure who his mother is. because when Lyman Ellithorpe, who was the father of our story people, he and his brothers moved from Vermont to northernmost New York. I don't think you can get hardly any further north in New York State and still be in New York State. So very much in the North Country is what they call it back there. And this is where Lyman Ellithorpe, the father, is farming with his two brothers. The problem that I'm having is with his middle name, Sanford. In my recollections, and I trace this family all the way from getting off the boat in 1638 in Massachusetts Bay Colony all the way westward, there's no Sanford in their line. So what I did, I went into the 1830 census, and I'm looking for my character, Lyman Ellithorpe, and I noticed that he had an elderly woman in her 60s and a younger woman aged in the 15 to 20 age bracket. That sent off signals in my head that the older lady was his mother. I knew that because she had moved up there with the brothers. But the next name on the list in the 1830 census was the Sanford family. So I'm starting to piece this together a little bit, thinking, okay, Sanford is the next door neighbor. This boy's middle name is Sanford. There is a strong possibility that there was a connection between young Lyman Ellithorpe and one of the daughters of Samuel Sanford. But that's only conjecture on my part. But I think I can build a fairly strong case for it. Also, Danforth is an interesting character in terms of mystery because I question whether his activities prior to the Civil War didn't put him in the category of being a draft dodger. Because up until the Civil War's start in 1861, he had been a resident in Buffalo, New York for just about a year. But then once the war started, he is living in Canada. And he is married to a Canadian lady. And they had 3 children while in Canada. And then in 1865, I find his name resurfaced in the Buffalo City Directory. So he left the country in 1861, did not serve in the Union Army. He shows up again in Buffalo in 1865. That sends off warning signals in my mind, of whether he was leaving for love and marriage and all that stuff, or whether he was trying to avoid the war. It's interesting that once the war was over and he was back, he was a resident of the United States of America for the rest of his life. In fact, on one of the more fun discoveries, I uncovered that Lyman here went out to the Black Hills in 1874. And if some of you know your Western history, that's the gold rush era in the Black Hills. And that's where you've got the Sioux Indians and you've got Custer showing up and all that sort of stuff. But he returned to Buffalo for a few years. And then in 1880 or 1881, he took the family from Buffalo and they went out and they homesteaded in a rural county in South Dakota. And that's where he lived out his life, and he died in 1904. So the one thing that all of this should maybe signify is that, was Danforth the oldest brother to the 4 children that followed, or was he the child? I don't mean to be humorous here, but the child of a different mother. In other words, say, Shirley, where are you? Step? Because I always get those mixed up. So anyway, that's one mystery in the book, and obviously it's taken me a little bit of time to explain it, and it's obviously maybe why the editor decided some of this stuff we can snip off because it's not necessarily germane to the topic itself. But to me, it made kind of an interesting mystery. Mystery number 2. Remember the joke, who's in Grant's tomb? Well, this is sort of like, who's in Philander's grave? Now, Philander was the older brother, and the family hailed from Rushford, New York. And 3 people in the family are buried there. But there's one gravestone, you probably remember, I explained that the stone isn't there, the headstone, it's just a slab. And for many years, there was talk that Philander was the unknown Civil War fatality. But that's goofy because his best friend was the town manager in Rushford until the 1890s. Philander here wrote not only the county history of Civil War soldiers, but he wrote in the city's centennial book in 1912, the village soldiers who fought in the war. This photograph is allegedly of Philander. And I share it with you folks because here's a scoop, it's not in the book. And you would think that it should be in the book, and I would agree 100%. But this photograph, and it's a soldier in a cavalry uniform. Whenever you find a photograph on a place like Find a Grave, they always, as some of you know, will identify who had submitted the photograph. Well, as a historian, I have to know if this is legit. I can't just look at it and go, oh, somebody's put Philander here. I mean, this could be Adolf Hitler, and they're calling him Philander. I need verification. And I tried twice. We had one of the historians, county historians back in New York, look into it. And none of us could break through the ice. And it could be the person didn't want to deal with us. It could be the person has passed away. It could be that their email address is no longer up to date. I mean, it could be a whole bunch of stuff. But it's interesting that on several websites, and these are reputable websites like Virginia Tech's Civil War website, they have a Civil War photograph collection, and they've got him in there. And I even contacted Virginia Tech and I said, can you verify that that's who this is? And basically, the reaction I got was, well, yeah, it's him. But they weren't essentially giving me any good vibes that they had any better information than I did. So if Virginia Tech wants to put them on their website and call them Philander, I go for it. But I couldn't do it in this book because that's not the way good history is done. What I will point out with Philander, who's in Philander's grave, Philander is not buried in Rushford, New York. Shirley and I, and all you Husky fans, and I know there's a bunch of you out there, so I'm going to kind of duck down here. When Shirley and I were coming back from the Rose Bowl in 2020, we stopped in Fresno, California, because I had a tip. Philander's 2 oldest sons were buried in Fresno. And we decided that to go to the cemetery and look for Philander. And you can see here on the right-hand side, That's his stone with an E on the end, I'll point out, in the family plot of his two young sons. And that comes out in the end of the book because, as many of you know, I don't finish this book with the ending of the Civil War. I carry the story all the way through to the final deaths of these people. And just as a side note, it's interesting because about 2 weeks after about 2 weeks after my book was published, it was interesting to me to see that on Find a Grave, the information about Philander being buried in Rushford was changed to Fresno, California. So it's kind of nice to see that a little bit of impact. Somebody's following this out there. Okay, this is my favorite of the myths. Civil War photo sleuth. And there's a website called Civil War Photo Sleuth. And they teach historians how to look at a picture of someone in their 80s to see if it's indeed a photograph of a Civil War soldier. It's kind of like some of that stuff you see on TV, where they do that facial recognition, and all the points on your face and all that stuff. Well, I could not find a photograph of my main character, Philip Ellithorpe, but I eventually did. And here's how it happened. First of all, Philip mentioned in letters throughout the war that he had wartime photographs taken of himself. Many of the soldiers had these photos taken, and they would be no bigger than a playing card, and it would have their photograph on it. And they were called carte de visites. I guess to make it French, it must have made it special or something. So anyway, he had 4 photographs taken, but I could never find any of them. And I looked high and low. But in December of 1861, Philip wrote a letter to his sister, Anne, saying that he was sick and that he was going to convalesce, so to speak, with a man whom the family knew well, Asa Burleson. He's the man who eventually is going to marry Anne, the sister. So Philip is convalescing with Asa, and I knew that there was a photograph taken of Philip filling in for a sick soldier who was in a drum and fife band of the 5th Vermont. Well, I scoured the Library of Congress for 5th Vermont musicians, and the Vermont Historical Society has got a great collection online. I could find stuff on the 4th Vermont and the 6th Vermont in terms of their musicians, but I could not find one of the 5th. Well, that was until, and this is almost spooky real. About a week and a half before I had to submit the final draft, which was a year ago, I might point out, I came across a photograph that was entitled Unknown, actually I left a word out, Vermont Fife and Drum Musicians, Camp Griffin, which is Langley today, Virginia, 1861. It was a photograph that was taken by the official photographer for the state of Vermont. So I thought, this is really something. I need to look into this a little bit. Unknown band, could it be? Well, let's take a peek. This is what the photograph looks like. And Joseph, is there any way to turn the front bank out? Because there's something I want the folks to see, and it's kind of faded at the top.
Have to kill all the way. Let's see. Oh, we've got enough light from outside.
Okay. Okay, so here we have this unknown band. Now my search then is for Philip Ellithorpe, who was, remember, a bucktail, and I've got a photograph with the headdress in a bit. But the question is it the 5th Vermont? Well, I'm looking all over at the men in the picture. And then just as an afterthought, my bleary eyes look in the upper left-hand corner and I can see the faint appearance of a flag. Well, it looks kind of like the American flag with the stripes, but when you look at the stars, it looks like they're in a circular pattern, almost like you would see in some of the revolutionary flags in our country. But I thought to myself, I'm going to play a long shot here. I need to know what the flag of the 5th Vermont looked like. So I went to a website, and here is what the flag. We can't see because of the our faces here over in this column, but it's 2 concentric ovals with a single star in the middle. To represent the single star in the middle is to represent the Republic. And I'm thinking, oh, this is the flag of the 5th Vermont. And so I went back to and you have to go back in your brain to the previous screen. That's the flag that's flying in this photograph. So I'm thinking, okay, this could be the 5th Vermont, but I need more information. So what other information could I come up with? Well, remember that Philip fought in the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, known as the Bucktails. They were the guys that would snip the tail off a deer and pin it to their cap, and they became known by the nickname the Bucktails. So I'm wondering to myself, is there a bucktail in that photograph? Secondly, Asa Burleson, who was the head of the 5th Vermont band, eventually when musicians were reassigned, he eventually became an officer in Company H, the 1st New York Dragoons. Well, how does this all help me with this photograph? Well, remember this slide that I've shown frequently. It's very romanticized, but you get the idea that these guys wore that kind of headgear. And secondly, there is a photograph in existence of Company H, 1st New York Dragoons officers, and Burleson was a 2nd lieutenant. I actually saw a photograph of the officers of that company. It was in a little museum in Gettysburg dedicated to Bucktails history. And on the back of the photograph, it had 1st New York Dragoons Company H. And on the photograph side, a guy with a great big beard. Now, and not just any guy with a big beard. The guy at the top of the picture is the same fellow that I saw in that photograph in Gettysburg. And if you think about it in terms of where you stand in photographs, I know that when we take a family photograph, the person that's in the center at the top is my wife, the head of the family. And I stand somewhat close by. And then in descending order, you've got the kids and then the grandkids. Well, Civil War photographs, especially of regiments or bands in this nature, they were the same way. The key individual is the guy at the top. This photograph of showing Asa Burleson, all bearded and all, that gives me another piece of the puzzle, but I'm still not satisfied yet. But here's where things get really, really interesting. Because if you look 2 people down from Asa at the top, you see the little guy down at the bottom. In fact, we're lucky because we can get him in on the screen. You can see on the, as you're looking at the photograph, on the right side of his hat, you see that little bit of fuzz or bucktail. So I've got 3 pieces of evidence now that this photograph was of the 5th Vermont Band, that the leader of the band, so to speak, was Asa Burleson, and corroborated by the photograph in Gettysburg. And the young guy down at the bottom in the front row has the little bit of fuzz on the right side of his cap, a bucktail. So with all of that kind of piecing together, I determined that I finally did find a photograph of my character. Now, when you look in the book, I just want to point this out. And by the way, the remarks I'm about to make, I accept full responsibility because I'm the author of the book. This is the photograph that went into the book. And when you receive a manuscript before it becomes book form, the author goes through it meticulously. I mean, looking at everything, looking for double commas and footnotes. And I mean, your head starts swimming in terms of everything that needs to be checked and double checked. I was so darn pleased with all the photographs I saw. I went right by this one and I didn't even give it a second glance. Well, when the book arrived and I'm sitting down with it in my hands, I'm starting to go through it page by page, I came to this and I just let out a gasp. And can you imagine why? What's missing? The flag. If you don't have that flag, you can't start to unravel this story. This has to be identified specifically as the 5th Vermont. Now, there's a good ending to my story and my sloppiness in not catching this. If this book ever does hit a second printing, my publisher knows we're going to fix this photograph. If they want to crop, that's okay with me. Crop out all of that wood in the front of the photograph and allow the top part to be seen so that you can see the flag, because it's crucial to the story. And as I say, I take full responsibility because I should have seen this and I should have corrected it when I had the opportunity, but I missed. Mystery number 4. The photo that you see on the screen is of Robert Fenton Ward. And he plays a rather interesting part in my story. At the beginning of the Civil War, Ward was the hospital steward for the Bucktails. Now, the role of the hospital steward was whenever a soldier would report to the sick tent, the hospital steward would write down his name, turn it into the company captain, who in turn would turn it into the colonel of the regiment. And in that way, through the adjutant general of the regiment, it's almost like a roll call if you're a teacher. You know how in the old days, how we used to do it in writing. Well, the thing is, early in the war, Philip was sick quite a bit, or at least he was in the hospital quite a bit. And I paint a pretty unvarnished interpretation of the fact that he may have been sick, Many soldiers were sick, especially in the first year and a half of the war. But the timing of his illnesses also seemed to coincide with impending battles, which might indicate that he's trying to get out of the fight. So Fenton Ward here, he knew Philip really well. Now, Ward himself became a lieutenant after the Battle of Antietam because they needed officers, because so many officers in the Union Army had been killed or wounded. He himself was wounded a few months later at Fredericksburg. And at one point, shortly after him being wounded, you can see that he's kind of had enough of Philip not being there when they need him. And this guy said to Philip at one time, and this is Philip telling his sisters this in a letter, Lieutenant Ward says he'll sign my medical discharge papers immediately, but I'm intent on doing my duty and staying until the war is over. So you got an interesting paradox going on here. A young 18-year-old who's not really up to killing other human beings, but he doesn't want to desert and he doesn't want a medical discharge. Well, why do I spend so much time with Ward? Well, it's because as we get down to the fourth note here, when the Bucktails were to be mustered out, they had served their 3 years. Soldiers in the Civil War, actually the administration, the Lincoln administration, determined that when units were due for discharge, they would not take new recruits and put them into those regiments. Instead, they would disband those regiments and create new regiments. And the way they would fill the new regiments was with soldiers who wanted to continue to serve. So Ward here is one of those. He's promoted to being the captain of Company I of a new regiment, the 190th Pennsylvania. Well, he wasn't captain for very long because, as you see on the next note, there was a battle fought called the Battle of Weldon Railroad on August the 19th, 1864. It was one of those battles where General Grant was trying to break the Confederates that were protecting Richmond. It was a bloody battle, but what's important in terms of my character is that his regiment, the 190th, was at the spearhead of a Union advance that was encircled by the Confederates. And it was a real bloodbath. And there was so much mayhem at this Battle of Weldon Railroad that some men were killed and left on the field. Others were captured and became POWs, and the lucky few escaped by literally fighting their way out of encirclement. Well, where was my headline up here is where did Fenton Ward go? Because in his medical service records, it shows that he is discharged on August 19th, 1864, the very day of the Battle of Weldon Railroad. So was he killed and left on the battlefield, an unknown soldier buried in an unknown grave? Did he desert? Did he surface somewhere else? All of the major books that deal with Pennsylvania regiments never identify anyone from the captain all the way down to the lowest private. They never identified any soldier assigned to Company I. But 3 months later, they do identify a new captain of Company I. So Fenton Ward disappeared. And that was a real mystery to me. And when I speak in Pennsylvania in October, this very slide, this is the one that's going to have people on the edge of their seats. This is kind of important information to be shared with them, because I found him. Fenton Ward, before the war, was a printer. His father had owned the newspaper in the local town, like Kelso, small town. In the 1880s, he surfaced, or in fact, I can't place his starting date, but in the early 1880s, he was what was called a compositor, or if we're using the French, the compositeur, at the New York Times. So he's working in New York in his profession. Then on June 9th, 1884, he passed away from consumption in Hoboken, across from Manhattan, and he was buried in a pauper's grave in Holy Name Cemetery in Jersey City, New Jersey. And this kind of struck me as really sad. In fact, when I talk about some of these buck tales after the war in the appendix in the book, I make the statement, the very last sentence. I said, this is a sad ending to a promising life. So this fellow, important to my character during the war, and led a somewhat unfortunate life afterwards. Okay, this is where we go from really serious to really goofy. You might notice that from the photograph here, this is one of the men that's on the cover of the book. It's General Elisha G. Marshall. I love that. Well, I don't love that beard, but it's definitely different. It's unique. Now, what makes this guy kind of interesting to me, and here's how he comes into the story. He was from New York, just like Philip and Philander Ellithorpe. And remember that photograph of Philander in his cavalry uniform, and keep that thought in mind. This fellow Marshall had been a colonel in a regiment. He had been wounded at Fredericksburg. And then after he recovered, he helped to recruit the 14th New York Heavy Artillery. And they were nicknamed the Heavies. Now, just a little sidelight here. When soldiers tended to re-enlist in the Army, and many of them did because they were paid to do so. They were called bounty soldiers, but they were experienced. Most of them did not want to go back into the infantry. They wanted either to go on horseback or they wanted to go into the artillery, because the heavy artillery would be far behind the battle lines, and they'd be shooting shells into the battlefield. And because the heavy artillery, well, they were called heavy artillery, they got the nickname the Heavies, and it was a derisive term because it implied that these fat, chubby doughboys were sitting back there lobbing shells while the rest of us grunts are up front fighting. Well, regiments that were composed of heavies were, they proved themselves to be anything but what the stereotype was projecting. They were good fighters. But here's where the heavies come into the story here with Elisha G. Marshall. Since he had a West Point degree, he was promoted to brigadier general. And they gave him what was called the Provisional Brigade, that was made up of 2 regiments of heavies and 2 regiments of dismounted cavalry. Now, Philander Ellithorpe was in one of those dismounted cavalry regiments. So he was under Alicia G. Marshall here. Now, the point that I want to make is the 4th line down. Marshall had a very low opinion of Philander's regiment, the 2nd New York Mounted Rifles, and justifiably so. You see, Philander's regiment, when they were first enlisted as cavalry, they didn't receive horses, and they were ticked. And they were sent to what was called dismounted camp outside of Washington, D.C. to learn horsemanship with no horses. So the longer they sat from March and April and early May without horses in a horse training camp, Philander's unit got real surly. In fact, one of their officers, a major, complained from the lowest officer in the brigade all the way up to the Secretary of War and President Lincoln, saying, we've been done wrong. We joined up to be dismounted cavalry. Where's the horses? Well, eventually there was a court-martial for this guy, because you don't step on all of these toes, all the way from your, level of at the regiment all the way to the President of the United States. And he was eventually exonerated in I think it was the 1970s. It took that long to kind of clear his name, because he had a legitimate grievance. He was also unfortunate in the sense that after Philander was wounded, he was captured at the Battle of the Crater. And I don't know if you know much about the campaign for Petersburg, but what happened was the Union Army could not break the Confederate defenders at Petersburg and Richmond. So one Pennsylvania guy comes up with this idea: let's dig a tunnel from our line underneath theirs, T-bone it at the end, and then pack it with this explosives, blast the heck out of them, and in the ensuing mayhem, rush their lines and break them. Well, on paper, it sounded pretty good, because several of those Pennsylvania companies had a lot of miners that knew how to build safe tunnels. Problem was, the explosion occurred, the dust is everywhere, a big crater is established. The Union soldiers ran down into it, and by the time they got down to the bottom of the crater, the Confederates had seen something's amiss here, and they picked them all off, and eventually a number of Union soldiers were captured. Many from Philander's unit himself, and they were sent to Andersonville, which is not good. A very unhealthy prisoner of war camp where many Union soldiers died. Well, this guy, he interests me, and I was surprised the editor put him on the cover of the book. I think they were kind of captivated by his whiskers as much as us. But what made this guy kind of stand out, and this is where I say we go from a serious Fent Ward story to kind of a goofy story. The skull of Alicia G. Marshall. In June of 2000, his tomb in Rochester was desecrated by what they think were satanic cultists, because what these people went in for was this man's skull. And then they would take his bones and they put them in certain order out around the crypt. So they felt fairly certain that it was a satanic cult. I thought that's kind of gross for people to be doing that. But it goes to show that some of these characters, even long after they've passed away, are still cropping up in history from time to time. Now, the last slide, the last mystery, and this isn't really a mystery, but remember I told you earlier that if we do a second edition of the book, we're going to fix that photograph. The other thing we're going to fix, well, there's three things, but the second thing we're going to fix is the paper that you have in your hand that my wife gave you coming in. And it's just a 2-page article. It's based largely on Bill Watson's fine work in the Cowles Historical Quarterly. And let me check the slide here. And I want this little 2-page item to be in the next book or the revision, because this is where the letters originated from. And unfortunately, these 800 words that you've got in your lap fell on the editor's floor, clipped off. It was one of the casualties of publication. But second go around, I have more say, and I'll want this piece to be put in there. And you'll know, oh, these are my grandchildren. My granddaughter, you can't see her off to the far right, but she is so worried about all of the moss that's on the bottom of that picture. She's busy scraping the moss off. And this is up at the Cowles Gardens, where a number of Civil War soldiers are buried. What I wanted to finish with was, I love this photograph, and this is going to be included in a little appendix the next time around. This is Kit Carson Post number 49 in Kelso, Grand Army of the Republic. It's the Civil War soldiers' version of the American Legion. Now, this photograph, I always like to think about setting and evidence of timing of it. Now, we know from various records that it was between 1892 and 1895, but I want you to consider the fact that when a veteran, and the people in my book, I take them into the 19-teens, and they're involved with these veteran activities after the Civil War. So that's why this photograph and this material that's in your lap works so well as a little appendix. For the Grand Army of the Republic, there were 2 occasions that were absolutely important on their annual calendar: Memorial Day and the 4th of July. Now let's consider both of those just for a minute in terms of how we would prepare and dress for these 2 events. For me, on the 4th of July, I'm wearing my shorts and my t-shirt, and we're going to get elephant ears down at the lake, and we're going to watch entertainment and stuff like that, picnic atmosphere. That's one kind of dress. Another kind of dress is where you put on your Sunday best. And it's not so much a frolic as it is representing honor and respect. So knowing the 2 holidays, as you look at this photograph, you have to ask yourself, how are they dressed? Look at the girls in the little white dresses in the front row. And if you can see closely enough on the screen or on the paper I handed to you, they're holding little American flags. On the right side of the screen, you have a bunch of Kelso toughs, young men, but they too are dressed in vests and their Sunday finery. In the background, you can see the banner for the Kit Carson Post number 49, and it has a large number of men encircling it. And then the one part about this photograph that really kind of was giving me fits was the little banner that's on the left-hand side. And then I started to look at who was standing around it. And I'm thinking, that's a contingent of women. Now, the Grand Army of the Republic was an organization devoted to the men who had fought the Civil War. But they had an auxiliary known as the Women's Relief Corps. And it's my conjecture that that banner there, surrounded by women, is the auxiliary of that corps. So basically what I'm saying to you is I have pretty good grasp of the fact that this is probably the Memorial Day photograph and taken somewhere between 1892 and 1895. Now, as we draw to a close, I think it's important for everyone listening here and all of the Zoomers at home to see the finality of the work that David Fries had first entrusted in me. Exactly 1 year ago today, on May the 5th, 2021, the Cowlitz County Historical Museum donated Oliver Webster Moore's, remember he was one of the son-in-laws that married one of the Ellithorpe daughters. We donated Moore's mahogany framed photo of the 1896 reunion of his Company K, 1st Minnesota, an 8-page memoir of pioneer life in territorial Wynona County in the 1850s, and an expose on horticultural advancements undertaken in southern Minnesota in the 50 years between 1850 and 1900. These three donations went to the Wynona County Historical Society 1 year ago today. It's almost creepy. And then final gift, and this is the biggie. Similarly, the Cowlitz County Historical Museum donated the 180 letters, Civil War letters drafted by the Ellithorpe siblings to the McKean County Historical Society in Smethport, Pennsylvania. And Philip's epistles are now back where they belong, in Bucktail country. Now I have one sentence to read because it reflects on you all here and at home. You could hit the lights, Joseph, that'd be great. At the end of the acknowledgements, I wrote this, and it's pertinent to you all that are interested in this topic. I had thanked people, like David Fries and Rose Janke and a few others, some professors that I know that beat up my manuscript from time to time. And I thanked my wife. But then I said, perhaps the biggest perk to all of our adventures was meeting so many wonderful and supportive people along the way who were fascinated to learn about the complex story I was chasing. In the end, all for the Union gave me far more than I had ever expected. I hope the readers enjoy my book. And by saying that, I want you all to feel that this book was born here. This book is a part of Cowlitz County. And the fact that you people have turned out session after session to listen to me about this story, well, it tells me that you're interested in it. But I want you to know that from me looking out at you, I'm really appreciative of the kind of support I receive from the Historical Society and for patrons such as yourselves. Well, as Paul McCartney says, it's the end.
We'll open it up for some Q&A if I just need to get out of the screen share here for our online friends. And Danielle, can you give me a thumbs up if things are looking okay on the screen? And for our online friends who have questions, Danielle, shall we have them type it into the chat box, or should we just open? Okay, Danielle says if you have questions online, put it into the chat box, and then we'll be able to see them here in the meeting room, and I can read them out loud if you like. But are there any questions? We'll start. Any questions for John from our live audience?
I've exhausted you. Well, you know, speaking of being overwhelmed, one of the difficulties I had in getting a publisher was the length of the book. And this publisher was the only one out of 5 that was willing to take a shot, but I had to pare 60,000 words off of it. But in the finished product here, it'll say the book is 432 pages long, but in fact, 100 pages are footnotes. So it's heavily footnoted. And that added to it, and I felt that that was necessary. Yes?
I know you said this, but would you repeat the path that you took when you got papers here, letters here, and how you went about writing the book?
Well, the letters were all bundled in red ribbon. And so I would take the bundles apart. And the first thing I wanted to do was have kind of a scope and sequence idea of how many, essentially who was writing letters when. And I created file folders for them. And then after doing that kind of cataloging type stuff, then I started to read them and type through them. And it was really kind of an interesting process because, and that took me 6 months, but it's an interesting process because I would revisit my notes from time to time. And I'd go, that isn't right. So I would go to the history books and I would find, sometimes I would find information that the history books clarified that because I would write my impressions of in the notes. I would say I would type out a quotation, and then underneath the quotation, I would say, is this guy really here? Well, I find out from other sources, yes, he was. So it was kind of an interesting way of doing it because I found out along the way that some of my first impressions were wrong. And eventually I was able to correct those. So once I had the letters all transcribed, then that's when I went to the history books to read about the battles and the generals and all that stuff, so that I could this is a story first and foremost about the family, but the background is the Civil War. So by doing that, I was able to kind of dovetail both of them together. Yes.
I think people would be interested to know too that when you had all these little folders created in the little sleeves, he wore gloves all the time.
Oh.
And he'd take the letters out, and he had a magnifying glass,
Yeah.
and he would go over that. He asked me to look at something and see what I thought it said. I'm terrible at that. But faded, very faded. Yeah, and so he would take that magnifying, and I'd come downstairs and he'd have that thing and his gloves on and just, handling them very carefully.
Remind me about the gloves in a minute, but the letters were in a very broad, some were very readable. They were with ink. Some were in pencil that were written on hardtack boxes in tents while it's snowing outside. Some were so faded that I would put them up to the window to try to get some light to come through on the other side. And I know that in the museum business today, there's electronic ways of darkening things. I didn't have that at my disposal. I had to just do it the old-fashioned way.
These letters were in the East Coast and they were carried out.
Yes, they were. What the travel from the family was from Western New York, just south of Buffalo, toward the Pennsylvania line. After the Civil War, the two sisters who married the two brothers-in-law, they moved to southern Minnesota, and they lived their lives out there. One of them was a man named Moore, and in fact, Ditlevson Moore, across from the Methodist Church, is one of Mr. Moore's grandchildren. So when in 1923, with the forming of Longview, one of Moore's grandsons just graduated from law school at the University of Minnesota, and he came to Longview, and he became a lawyer here in town, rather prominent lawyer, I might add. And then the second grandson came out in the 1940s, and he's the one that operated the funeral home at Ditlevson Moore.
They carried these letters with them.
Yes, because in the early or in the late 1930s, their father came out here too because his wife had died. So you have the two grandsons and the son of Oliver Moore. And for my way of thinking, again, I've got to make some suppositions. These letters were found here. They were turned in here. So how did they get here? Well, it's sort of like a case of, okay, let's back up in history and go from the grandsons to the father to the grandfather, who was the last living person to have these letters. And he lived until 1926. He was 96 years old. So anyway, that's how the letters arrived out here. And when the Moore grandsons had passed away, the letters were, I believe, when we were talking about it earlier on, they were stored in a trunk or something for decades until they were turned into David here. And basically David's issue, as I recall, was one of space. We didn't have enough space for storage, and the topic itself, the Civil War, they truly do belong in a place that Civil War stuff is deeply rooted in the community. So that's why the letters were passed on to McKean County.
Yeah, that second reason was the more important one. They need to find a home.
Next to your book.
Yeah. What's that?
Right next to your book.
John, we have a question from one of our online people. Bob Chase is asking, when reading the letters, did you find spelling errors and grammatical errors which might confuse the meaning?
I found a lot. I describe the quality of the letters. These boys probably had a 6th to an 8th grade education. They had problems with punctuation, capitalization, spelling. One of my favorite ones is for the word there, like there's our Reb over there. Instead of saying there, they would say thar, spelling it out, Thar. So as you read the letters, and I explain this in the introduction, I don't want to mess with that because that gives it the flavor of the 1860s. I didn't want to get into being a spell checker and correcting grammar. I wanted you to feel what they were feeling with the words they were using. So I ran into that. I didn't run into too much in the way of language interfering with meaning. They were remarkably candid in their conversations in the letters. So I don't know if that hits the mark, but I didn't run into too much in the way of difficulty with understanding their meaning. It is interesting that Philip, the main character, was really seemingly protective of his parents, especially his mother. He wasn't real, upfront isn't the right word, but he wasn't totally candid with the things he was seeing and doing. But you'll notice that one of the chapters in the book is a quotation. The title of the chapter is a quotation. I've seen enough of this unjust war. Well, that ought to tell you where he's coming from. He's had enough of war. He's had enough of seeing men who have lost limbs and men who are in such agony, they're asking to be shot and killed. You know, this isn't the normal kind of stuff that you would maybe expect a soldier to be writing home to his parent or sister about. But as the war progressed and these soldiers became more battle hardened, these kinds of conversations in the letters appeared with more frequency. So you will get a sense of the Civil War for doggone sure. You'll get a broad overview of the campaigns and why they were fought, where they were fought. But I wanted this book to be a story about the average enlisted man, which these guys were. These weren't officers. You will find no photographs in this book of President Lincoln. We've seen enough of him. There's none of Grant or Lee or anything like that. I looked for photographs of company captains and regimental officers. And once or twice I would slip in a division commander because he was important to that part of the story. But I really wanted this to be a bottoms up view of the Civil War. And you'll see that I stress a great deal the women in the story, the two sisters. They're co-stars for doggone sure. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the Ellsthorpes, were they farmers, workers, factory people? It didn't sound like they came from a business background.
Yeah, that's interesting. They moved into a small hamlet to start their family in the mid 1830s, and they had a farm. And in the first chapter, I actually have a census, an agricultural census showing the kinds of things they were producing on their farm. And it was a fairly productive farm. But then in about 1853, 20 years later, you know, all the kids are born, they sell the farm and they move into the city, the village of Rushford. And they experience real economic hardship. In 1853, there was a real bad panic economically in the United States that wiped out many folks. They ran in and out of trouble with not paying their mortgage. They had their homes several times items put on auction. In one letter that is in the book, young Philip says to his sister, "When I come home, I'm going to re-enlist and get a bounty and let some of those boys at home fight who made fun of me during school days. They were poor. They were just scratching, they were just getting by the time the war came around. So their economic prospects of the 1830s continued into the 40s, but then by the 50s, it really dovetails down. And there's family tension, without a doubt. The father, I can't quite get a handle on him. Something, and you'll find this in the book yourself. I don't want to, give too much away, but the children in their letters, they loved both of their parents, and they wrote to both of their parents, and you could see a real fondness there. But there's something in the way the father treated the oldest daughter that wasn't right. Now, and I'm not trying to make a case for abuse here, or at least not physical abuse, but he was kind of mean. And I can't understand necessarily why, but at one point, his daughter, had already married Asa, and Asa was ready to come home and essentially duke out the old man because he was being so harsh with his new young wife. And I just don't get it. And the father shows up again after the war, trying to collect a Civil War pension based on the military career of his two sons. Well, that was allowable, providing a person could make a case for the father relying on the sons for a livelihood economically before the war. And he had to have documentation. So the father asked the son-in-law, Asa, to write him a recommendation. And Asa's letter would peel the paint off of this wall, because he said, look, this man was fully capable of working before the war. He owns nothing except the clothes on his back. So, I mean, he's destitute. And even though he's destitute, Asa is saying to the pension board, don't give this guy any money. He doesn't deserve it. And, that's why I'm saying this is a family story. And in some cases, it's a family being torn apart.
Thank you very much, John. There are more books in the front if you'd like to purchase a autographed copy from John. And everybody out there at home, come on down to the museum. We have copies of the book here at the museum that will be available. And we will see you at the next First Thursday, which will actually be at 6 o'clock, not 7 o'clock. When I was talking with Jim, he had a schedule situation where he needed to come in at 6 o'clock. So First Thursday next month will be 1 hour earlier. So we will see you next month at First Thursday, 6 o'clock. Have a great night, everybody, and we will see you all soon. Enjoy the rain.